beginning in 1962, I was involved in New York City in what was called the Mimeograph Revolution. That is, we were publishing mainly poetry magazines with a pacifist and anti-nuclear flavor on mimeograph machines. There were 2 or 3 types, and there was the open drum speedo print, and there was A.B. Dick, and Gestetner made mimeograph machines, which are not made anymore, really, but they had film stencils that you cut with a typewriter or with a stencil, and it was printing a magazine was very affordable, very, very affordable. For like $10, you could publish a poetry magazine and give it out or sell it at your poetry readings. So I heard about a guy beginning in about 1963 in Cleveland named D.A. Levy. He had purchased that year a letterpress with which he was printing these little pamphlets and books of poetry, combining his artwork and his very novel and interesting way of putting together pamphlets with different shapes of paper and different colors, and he'd put his own line cuts on them and his own artwork, and then I began becoming aware of his poetry, and he seemed to be a very interesting poet. So in 1964 he sent me a letter asking me if I'd like to send him a manuscript to publish, and he said, the wilder the poems, the more I enjoy printing them. So anytime anybody says, send me wild poems, I'd love to print them. So I was overjoyed. I remember dancing around my apartment in New York City, opening up my file drawers and pulling out a bunch of poems, and it became one of his earlier printed books, part letterpress, hand-bound, called King, Lord, Queen, Freak, which came out in '65. Then he came to New York City to visit. I hung out with him when he visited some friends in New York City, and he became exposed in New York City to another trend, the coffee house movement. The idea of reading poetry aloud in coffee shops was not very common since the 30s or since Vachal Lindsay, or most poets did not read in public in bistros. So that introduced Levy to the coffee house movement. And I sent him a lot of my publications, including Allen Ginsberg and I started at my bookstore, the Peace-Eye bookstore. I founded the Peace-Eye bookstore in late '64, after I'd already communicated with Levy. And Allen and Ginsberg lived just down the street. And Allen and I and some others formed the Committee to Legalize Marijuana, and put out a thing called the Marijuana Newsletter, which we sent to Levy in Cleveland. And that, unfortunately, helped trigger off some of his big problems with the law in Cleveland, and beginning in 1965 and continuing virtually up to when he killed himself in the fall of '68. Because he was, on one level, a marijuana martyr, much similar to the way that Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, but particularly Ken Kesey, was hounded by the authorities and threatened and really forced to really almost into retirement. And Timothy Leary sentenced to prison for a really small amount of marijuana. And others, the feds, right around the time that D.A. Levy was getting in trouble in Cleveland, the federal narcotics agents tried to set up Allen Ginsberg for marijuana arrest. So marijuana was the way to martyr the avant-garde, and Levy suffered that. He wasn't arrested, but he started putting out the Mary Jane Quarterly, and then he put out the Marijuana Review, which we know now were really looked with askance upon by the officialdom in Cleveland. For instance, they raided a bookstore in December of 1966 and specifically grabbed up the marijuana newsletter. And there was a big article in January of 1966 on page 1 of the Cleveland Plain Dealer under the headline, "Beatnik Leader Wants Marijuana." So, I mean, like they used, it was just before hippie replaced beatnik. See, when I went on civil rights marches in the South, they'd call you like beatnik trash or beatnik race mixer. Well, by the Summer of Love, it was dirty hippie. I mean, dirty beatnik was set aside, and in came dirty hippie. So, but they were using the headline, "Beatnik Leader Wants Marijuana." So in 1965, Levy, after all, was 22 years old, or just about 23. He was 23 years old. So he was relating to a very young crowd of poets as a kind of mentor to teenage poets and urging them to write poetry. And in the cathedral of the Trinity, there was a coffee shop. They set up a mock beatnik poetry coffee shop in Trinity Cathedral in Cleveland. And someone used the word cocksucker in a poem there. And now, if it were The Sopranos on HBO in 2003, you could utter 150 cocksuckers and add a few other suckers, and nothing would happen except people would go for popcorn during intermission. So, you know, but then it was a big deal. So so his association with marijuana, beatnik poetry, and the reading of possibly obscene poetry in a cathedral coffee shop, when added together with there was some sort of real estate, they wanted to clean up the neighborhood, there were real estate, he fell prey to real estate agents worried about the property values, and that hippies and beatniks and poetry readers and people that advocate legalization for consenting adults of use of marijuana posed a threat. So he attracted the attention of a prosecutor named George Mascarino, who kind of hounded him. In early '66, the first issue of the marijuana newsletter came out from Cleveland. At the same time, he was writing this important poem called The North American Book of the Dead, which is one of his more important works. So he was not yet, I don't think he was yet beginning his Buddhist studies. And meanwhile, he'd become a collagist. He had started, there was also a movement beginning in the 60s of putting together collages. There was Ray Johnson, William Burroughs was making collages, Claude Pellieu was another avant-gardist that was making collages. And Levy, I have collages that he sent me that are quite beautiful. So he early on became a scissor man, a Matisse man, a scissor man who was cutting interesting shapes. And then he wrote me in January '65. He says, "Have you read The Sacred Mushroom, Key to the Door of Eternity?" He goes on to say, it's a Bridie Murphy kind of thing in Egypt. "How aware are you of your Egyptianish poems? I am not finished with the book, but turn on like a light bulb cosmic high when reading it." And then he tells me in the same letter that there's a coffee house open, The Well. And he said it could be like the Le Metro in New York, only in Cleveland. Le Metro was where all the poets were reading. Bob Dylan went there, I went there, Ginsberg would go there, all the beat poets and other poets, that's where everybody read on 2nd Avenue in 1964 and 65. So he had been to New York, and he'd picked up on this. So he says, it is packed, and he says it was opened by a Christian. Everyone says it is unhip to talk about it. What is it? Do you know? In other words, leaving the church and going back to God. So he always had a very highly developed sense of religion. He was very attuned to the cosmos. He had a very polished sense of the universe as a living thing. So anyway, so he started hanging out at this coffee shop, and as I mentioned, that's when we had the committee to legalize marijuana form in New York City, and there's a famous photo of Allen Ginsberg outside the women's prison in Greenwich Village saying, "Pot is fun." I used to have that Pot is Fun in my bookstore. I wish I had it. I could put it up on eBay. What's it worth? 25 grand? If Johnny Depp pays $15,000 for a Jack Kerouac raincoat, hey, Ginsberg's Pot is Fun sign, we are talking giant. Anyway, so I had it, so he started putting out this marijuana quarterly, and then I mentioned as it went into January '66, DA had began to bring poetry to these coffee shops in the University Circle area near Western Reserve, and in those days, as I said, the word beatnik had a power to it. Now it doesn't. Now it's in the culture. But then the word beatnik was charged, like which could trigger off bliss or anger, depending on the person. So when they ran that headline, the Cleveland Plain Dealer in January '66, beatnik leader wants marijuana. I mean, that's like inviting the authorities to come bust in your pad. And that's basically what happened. Because right around that time, the first issue of the marijuana newsletter came out. But then he began a campaign to put a poetry collection into the Cleveland Public Library. He goes to the Cleveland Public Library and he says, "Where's all the poetry?" And he looks at the catalog, and what they have Robert Frost probably, and Edgar Allan Poe, and and so what he does, he puts together a gathering of poets and donates it as an act of goodwill to the Cleveland Public Library of Antonin Artaud, Clayton Eshelman, Diane Wachowski, Jonathan Williams, Charles Bukowski, Kenneth Rexroth, Bob Kaufman, Denise Levertov, Frank O'Hara, Paul Valery, Charles Reznikoff, Robert Creeley, Charles Olson, Gary Snyder. So he put this, he gave it to him. So as an example of his, so he was 23 years old, 24 by then, and was doing these public acts. He was implanting poetry into the coffee shops. He was proposing the legalization of marijuana. He was still doing letterpress stuff. He hadn't begun his underground. He was soon to begin an underground newspaper called Buddhist Third Class. Anyway. Yeah, Buddhist Third Class Junk Mail Oracle. Okay, so we go to November 16th, 1966, and there was a reading at the Gate. That's the coffee shop at the basement of the Trinity Cathedral in Cleveland. The police were there. They weren't looking for Eros. They were looking for the hounds of pot. Who's smoking pot? I mean, look, even in places where it's legal to smoke pot, you usually don't whip out your bogart. You don't whip out your joint in a cathedral. You know what I mean? It's even D.A. Levy. So it's not likely they would have had. But there were poetry reading, and voila, the word. What Monica Lewinsky did to Clinton near the Rose Garden, a word denoting that act was uttered. And so the grand jury later on that month, thanks to this prosecutor named George Mascarino, who parenthetically, 29 years later, could not remember anything about D.A. Levy. He hounded him in the 66 and 67, but he couldn't even remember his name. He couldn't remember the case. At least that's what he said to interviewers. So anyway, December 1st, so they indicted him for obscenity, for the word. I don't think it was his poem. I think it was another kid. I guess he incited some teenage boy to use the word cocksucker, So then there was this Asphodel bookshop, which was run by a friend of D.A. Levy's, and it was raided, and they took away 9 crates of D.A. Levy's publications, which Jim Lowell had in storage or on display, on the grounds that they might contain advocacy for legalization of pot. So, and Jim Lowell too was arrested. So it was a very strange. So then, what does the Cleveland Press headline have on January 9th, 1967? Grand jury named beatnik poet in secret indictment on filth. You know, classic Hearst-level journalism. So, you know, then things went on, and then we formed a committee, some of us, Allen Ginsberg and I. There was a guy in Cleveland that organized this benefit at Case Western Reserve. And the Fugs flew out, and Allen Ginsberg flew out. We did a good concert, raised a lot of money. It was for Levy's legal expenses. He was facing time. You know, he was... Levy, the plain dealer described the charge against Levy as follows. Levy is charged with accepting immoral and indecent poetry from the boy and publishing it, as well as reading and distributing it at the coffee house. So there were stickers, you know, legalized D.A. Levy. I remember those stickers. So then he was hauled into court on January 17th, and there was a legendary anecdote at the time. The judge says to Levy, the judge, and this is in Cleveland court, he says, "You write poetry, do you sell it?" And Levy said, "I sell poetry for 89 cents a day." And the judge says, "Well, bail of $2,500 is not excessive for a great poet. Maybe you should charge more than 89 cents. So Levy was what we call in the recording business, you know, prone to the noise. You know, he was, after all, he comes from a very reduced background. He wasn't educated. He told the plain dealer that his parents didn't have enough money to send him to school. He had a high school education. He was in the Navy for 7 months. He graduated from James Rhodes High School in '42, went into the Navy. I never could find out what happened, but he was out. And then, you know, became interested in poetry and Jack Teagarden and music and Peggy Lee records. He put out his early books. He described them listening to all the Jack Teagarden and Peggy Lee and jazz records. And so he was just a shy kid. You know, he was just part of him was, he was a very skinny, slender, shy. He didn't like crowds. He's the type of guy that reveled in close friendships, but he didn't like, yet he felt he had to organize. Part of him was also bursting out as an organizer. Up to that point, people who were to be poets in America generally left the Midwest. Hemingway left St. Louis. T.S. Eliot left. William Burroughs left St. Louis. Everybody, they went to the East Coast or to the West Coast. Cleveland, Levy decided, I think it was an act of Cleveland patriotism. He was a patriot of Cleveland. He wasn't going to let anybody drive him out. There was good music, there were coffee shops, there were cheap apartments, there was a university situation. You could get books and records and listen to jazz. There was stuff to smoke. There was the Beatles and Jimmy and Janis, and, you know, there was the Underground Papers, which he formed. So he decided to stick it out. But the establishment, real estate interests, and the marijuana hysteria, and fear of beatniks, beatnik phobia, and fear of the counterculture, and the anti-war movement was growing very big. 67, of course. 66, 67, 67, of course, was the great Detroit riots. A lot of the city got burned down. 67 was, you know, the Black Power had arisen, and there were a lot of, and there was a very, very strong anti-war movement, and, you know, we exercised the Pentagon that fall, so there was a big resurgence in America of radical activism, and Levy was singled out. It's like in 1984, where you don't take on a whole group of people. You pick someone like you. You're the enemy. You're the one that did it. If I attack you, then you're a symbol for everybody else, and everybody else will become nice, placid Americans and let the war go on. So, but Levy, meanwhile, was fearful. he studied telepathy. He believed, he became a kind of freelance Buddhist in a way. But he still, one of his last letters to me had a Jewish star on it. So he was like Allen Ginsberg. He had his remnants of his parental religion mixed in with the religions he was exposed to in the counterculture and also Buddhism. We were all flying. It's hard to remember. If you can remember the 60s, you weren't enjoying it. So we had decided to have a good time. We came in a very bacchanalic mode here. The Fugs, we were on tour, and we were in trouble ourselves. We were always being picketed by right-wing nurses, or the guy sheriffs, they would be threatening to arrest us. We had to have an attorney, civil liberties attorney, on retainer, so if we got arrested somewhere, we could call him up in the middle of the night and get advice. So it was a very people don't understand it now, but because there was not the freedom of expression that exists now. Then, of course, they just, Lenny Bruce had, basically his whole career had been halted because of arrests, not anywhere else but New York City, for performing in a Greenwich Village nightclub. So there was a police activity in the remember 67 where was the Summer of Love, and there was massive police activity throughout the country against communes, against kids living together, against crash pads. And so there developed a whole system of switchboards and community action centers, and there were a lot of communes forming. So he probably should have gone out, if he'd have gone out to Taos, and joined New Buffalo or a reality construction company, or I know he was headed off for California. Anyway, he started a newspaper called the Buddhist Third Class Junk Mail Oracle. Early in '68, he was very afraid of going to jail. He was facing 5 years. This is for publishing a kid's poem and causing it to be read in a coffee shop. So he was 5 years for charge of contributing to the delinquency of minors. So he pleaded nolo contendere, which caused a lot of, I think that was part of his guilt, part of his suffering, was he pleaded nolo, rather than fighting in court. He was afraid of going to jail. And who wouldn't? In the 60s, anything could happen. He could wind up being the bride of some biker in some prison in Ohio. Who would want that? So anyway, he, right after he did that, he sent me his manifesto on prose. It's called Prose on Poetry in the Wholesale Education and Culture System. And I don't have the little pamphlet here, but I remember he sent it to me, and it has the lines. Isn't that the one that has the lines? Where he basically says, "I thought poetry would be part of salvation and would help save the species," but then he has the line, "But the people want blood," and that had defined the last few months of his life. He was trying to put out this underground newspaper. Now it was fairly easy to put out an underground newspaper in the 60s because, first of all, it's still very, very inexpensive to print web press, on the big rolls of newsprint, newspapers. It's cheap. So he would some of his better collages are in the Buddhist Third Class Junk Mail Oracle. But he also got record ads. The liberal record labels like Reprise and Warner Brothers and A&M and Capitol and others would run ads, and then they would run ads for concerts and then hash pipes, things like that, or a thing called orgy butter they were selling. Anyway, he sold this stuff, but it finally he just couldn't. He couldn't keep it going, this underground newspaper. And he was really then getting, this is August, September 68. He killed himself later on in that same year. So I had seen him. That was August was the big police riots at the Democratic National Convention. So I had been in Cleveland. The Fugs came in there. We used to play Le Cave. And Levy would always come to our show, and we'd get him in free. And I wanted him to give me a mantram to send to Chicago, to print and hand out to help calm things. Charles Olson had sent me a mantram, and Ed Dorn and others. So I wanted one from Levy, but he was really... he just basically told me he couldn't do it. You know, he couldn't send me anything. But in August, he wrote this 24-page Suburban Monastery Death Poem. It's one of his final works, and it has a threnodic, repetitive refrain of language that's calling out to his friends. He has lines like, William Burroughs, rescue me. Forget that. Michel Ray, Yael Dayan, rescue me. Ingrid Schwanberg, Eileen Goodson, help. And then he had the language, Vajra Yogini, help. Papa Legba, open the gates. I don't want to die in Ohio anymore. And so then he's inscribed the cover of Suburban Monastery Death Poem to Ed Sanders and Kosher Musical Joint for Peace. And he drew a Jewish star underneath the kosher. And it's because in my bookstore, the Peace-Eye bookstore was built in an old kosher meat market, and I left the words strictly kosher on the front window with the Hebrew for strictly kosher, and then I put Peace-Eye bookstore above it. So anyway, he went to Madison. Now Madison at that time could have been a salvation zone for him. I mean, it was a little more progressive. There was a huge anti-war counterculture movement in Madison, and it was receptive. He had friends like Morris Adelson, and is that his name? Or Adelman? Adelson? Morris Adelson, who was a good friend, supportive. And so they had he was invited to be free university poet in residence in the alternative school associated with the University of Michigan. That was a long-lasting alternative school that Ken Michalowski taught at, and up until very recently it still existed. Anyway, he was invited to be a teacher, and his course was on telepathy, so he didn't feel he had to attend. So his students would come in there and they would attempt to communicate with him from afar by telepathic vibe exchange. But that was when he did his final artworks then. He did a series. Somebody gave him some ancient Greek texts, which he cut up very beautifully and made into collages. And then Nixon came. And right around the time Nixon was elected, very narrowly over Hubert Humphrey, he returned from Madison to Cleveland. I know he was thinking about moving to California. He was a real gritty guy. He hated to be driven away from his hometown. He wanted to hang out. Now it's very easy. Every state has an arts council, and every junior college has a slam or a coffee shop or a poetry reading series. So he was a young man who was at the peak of his powers. He had a lot of energy. He was a workaholic. He would print things for people. He was very selfless. But I think, without going into a lot of details, I think and his friends are going to moan and groan, but I think he was let down by his circle of friends. And I think he felt that you'll have to do research. There are some, he had some love problems. He had got his old. I mean, it's the horrible dynamic of the movement where people are naturally inclined to pair up as a husband and wife or a boyfriend and girlfriend and live more or less, if serially monogamous. But against that urge to live with one person and be true to one person, and it was the 60s sexual freedom and the concept of the group grope and people sleeping on the floor in a commune, and who knows who winds up with whom. And so I think you'll have to do the research. There are letters he wrote I know about. And so he had a turbulent love life that I don't think has been explored. Cleveland really treated him, they ought to, always talking about war reparations. They ought to You know that nice statue of James Joyce above Zurich? They ought to do a nice poured bronze statue of the slender and handsome young D.A. Levy with a letterpress next to him, and put it in the middle down there right next to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, old Levy Shrine, because the city owes him one. They owe him a monument, because he could have developed. He had a very refined sense of literature, and he was very smart. And he was just he was only, you know, he was 28 years old. I mean, he wasn't 20, he was 26 years old. He was 26 years old when he killed himself. I mean, he was just getting going. Allen Ginsberg didn't write Hal till he was 30. Allen Ginsberg had really not written a lot of interesting poetry, one or two good poems, before suddenly he was sitting in San Francisco and he had this notebook, I saw the best minds, something, 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 and he started typing based on that line, and out came a great poem. Levy was just warming up. You know, it's like a Pavarotti getting ready to hit a high C. You don't just get up and do it. You go into action, and you have a sacred study period. And he didn't have that. He couldn't go to college. He had parents that were both supportive and non-supportive. It's like poetry is part oi and part joy. The oi, the elegy, what's sad and tragic, the American tragedy about Levy is that he had to focus on oi and could not focus on joy. He should have been able to have that oi-joy balance and have years where he matured and wrote. I just feel he wasn't allowed to write his greatest work. But the work that he did write, there are wonderful sections and wonderful poems. It's as if Shelley had died before he wrote Ode to the West Wind. You know, that's the D.A. Levy tragedy. On November 24th, he shot himself in the forehead with his childhood 22, sitting lotus, and once again pled nolo contendere. It's always difficult to make sense of a poet's brief fluorescence. Hart Crane, D.A. Levy, the chaff of genius, blown up above harsh Cleveland. It may take centuries to sort him out. It often does with poets. The issues of economic justice and personal freedom, which wore out the good bard Levy, have not yet been addressed in America. And we need a way that a shyer and, yes, even more timorous and fearful genius can flourish their proper span. And Darrell Allen Levy lived not his span, but his poems, The Bells of the Cherokee Ponies, Kibbutz in the Sky, North American Book of the Dead, Cleveland Undercovers, and a big series of concrete books find their measure. Shine on, O D.A. Levy, rinsed in the American dream.